Time to visit with Rodney Orr from TiderInsider TV and TiderInsider.com. Rodney joins us every Tuesday to talk Bama football and more. And Rod, we did our Crimson Tide Rewind segment earlier with Scott Moore, and we did the 2002 season today, which I wanted to get your thoughts. Just such an interesting season. Some of the biggest wins that we had seen in recent memory with Alabama football that year. Some of the most dominant physical performances, of course, obviously the game at Tennessee, the game at LSU stand out, the near misses against Oklahoma and Georgia. But toward the end, you sensed that something, wasn't right. Of course, Alabama, played that season under the cloud of probation, and Franchione had scheduled the extra game at Hawaii to kind of be a reward for his players. But, we remember Dennis Franchione bolting too for College Station. It really was an interesting season, and you and I both covered it very closely. It was a lot different then. I said earlier I had Dennis Franchione live on my Iron Bowl special the night before the 2002 game. We could call him. We could make an appointment to go see him in the office. Those days are long gone. But just your recollections from what was a really interesting season for Alabama football.
Well, first thing, I'm a little inside joke here. I'll never forget the LSU game that night. First of all, what a great performance by Alabama, and Gary Harris put on a great show as well that night, the Little Red Corvette game, as I refer to it. But that was a tremendous performance. And you and I both, that night, we talked about it. We thought Alabama was, primed to really go into that Auburn game and dominate, and then we saw what happened. I think Alabama went for it, 5 or 6 times on fourth down in that game,
sure did,
including the very first possession.
Yep.
It was a strange feeling, but, I think while we're talking about that, we ought to talk about what happened the day before that game in San Antonio when it came out and one of the local sportscasters there released information that Dennis Franchione, according to his sources, would be the next coach at Texas A&M.
Mm-hmm.
And that was early that morning, if you remember, Gary, the Friday before the Alabama-Auburn game.
I do.
And I placed a call to Mike McKenzie. As you remember, he was kind of Coach Fran's PR guy, and placed a call to him to kind of get his feedback on that report, and did not hear from him all day. And then I guess it was like around 6 o'clock, and, it was just going crazy. Things were going crazy due to this rumor, and I'll never forget Mike calling me, and we talked about, this report, and I had no idea that he had me on a speakerphone with Coach Fran, and Coach Fran came on and assured me that that report was false, it had no validity to it, that he was going to be the head coach at Alabama, and he apologized for any inconvenience that it caused that day. And he said, "You can quote me." And I never forget quoting him on the board. Just got off the phone with Coach Fran,
mm-hmm.
and he has said this rumor is false. And of course, the board lit up, and everybody was excited about it. And it wasn't a week later he was or a little over a week later he was on a plane headed to Texas A&M.
Yeah, the wheels were already turning, and they took the trip to Hawaii and won that game, a tough game. But you talk to players now that were on that team, and they said he had already distanced himself from the team to some degree and got back and, like you said, went to College Station, and it was a downward spiral for him and quite frankly, a downward spiral for Alabama football for a few years. But interesting times, to say the least, and you and I have discussed it many times because of our, we got to know Coach Fran really well. I think we both consider him friends at the time, more than just as a coach, and he was a really good football coach. It just, Rodney, your thought process was, and I agreed, he just, Coach Saban can handle the pressure here. Coach Saban can stand up to what's needed Coach Fran couldn't do that. He had elephant ears a little bit. He heard what was going on. The probation concerned him. The fear of failure concerned him. He was a really good coach, but he just wasn't mentally strong enough to handle this job, was he?
Yeah, and I think he listened to, no offense, I did like Mike McKenzie, but I thought he listened to the wrong people, and probably Mike influenced him a little bit, and, that was my take on it. I just think he listened to the wrong people. I talked to Coach Fran a few times about how, important he was to the program. You knew the fans. He had full support. And he told me, he said, listen, what's going to happen to the support when we possibly have a couple of 500 seasons? He said, because that could very realistically happen with the losses that we're going to take in scholarships. And I know he was very disappointed. He was very upset. He did not hold anything back. He was very disappointed in Gene Marsh. He was very disappointed in the compliance department as a whole. But
should have been. I mean, Alabama got no breaks at all there. They got hammered.
Yeah, and I think he mainly. I got the impression, and he mentioned Marsh by name. So I know he was very disappointed. He felt a little bit misled. He felt like it was the situation had been mishandled, according to the things he told me. And I think that was the summer before his last season, 2002, and. I guess looking back at it, he was already at that point probably looking for an out. It was. I agree with you, Gary. I thought he was a fantastic coach. I thought he had a lot of Saban qualities, actually. His organization, his plan, and all of those things. But he didn't have the thick skin. And we talked about this a few weeks ago on your show. And on your station, on some other shows, Ryan's show, Ryan Fowler, that, this is a different monster here. This is a different program. People say, well, anybody can win. There's been a lot of guys that have won 10 games, but that's not really the goal. The goal is a national championship. And, you have to be able to block out all the noise, all of the, things that you hear. And I just don't think Fran was capable of doing that.
Indeed, and his career was never the same after he left Alabama, and Alabama went through some tough years following Franchione's departure. I guess one more thought on that, Rodney, and it's just how things have changed. Of course, under Mike DeBosa, it was even you could just walk into the football office and go up, knock on his door, and he'd let you come in and visit with him. But still under Fran, there was a lot of access. Like I said, he was really good to the local media. As I said, I had him on live the night before the 2002 Iron Bowl. I remember the junior varsity game they held, and he was sitting up there and I asked him if he would come down, and he came down on the photo deck and did an interview with me during the game, and tons of access to him. It's not that way now, and probably can't be. These are different times, right. But I sometimes miss that, don't you?
Yeah, I do. I understand the differences now, and I think the one thing I think we both are saying too is really liked Fran, but times have changed, and you certainly understand it takes a certain kind of person to manage this Alabama program, and they're hard to find. They're hard to come by. Great coaches who can manage everything that it takes to be successful here. A very, very difficult combination to find.
All right, after Dennis Franchione, there was the Mike Price debacle, and then Mike Shula came in and did his best in 4 years and had the one good year in 2005. But his dad today, the legendary Don Shula, I read out his list of accomplishments earlier, passing away at the age of 90, a pro football icon and a guy who did it, with a power run game with the Colts, and then his early years with the Dolphins, and then when Dan Marino came in, morphed into a wide open offense. Won 347 games. Rodney won a couple Super Bowls. Just your thoughts on the passing of the legendary Don Shula at the age of 90 today.
Yeah, hated to hear that. Growing up in South Texas, loved Don Shula, loved the Dolphins, and you say why South Texas, not South Florida, but see. Could not stand the Cowboys, and was really devastated when the Cowboys beat them. What was it, Gary? The 72 Super Bowl when the Cowboys beat the Dolphins 24-3. Yeah. And then the next 2 years, the Dolphins just dominated, and they were the team, and just loved the Dolphins. Bob Greasy, Earl Morrill. I remember so many guys, off those teams.
Oh, yeah.
Were, Jim Kick, Mercury
Morris, Larry Zonka, Bob Kuechenberg, Larry Little. You go on and on.
And Mercury, I think Mercury and, if I'm not mistaken, Mercury, Morris, and Zonka were the first two backs in NFL history on one team to go over 1,000-yard rushing.
They were.
And if you remember, the crazy thing about that was actually at the end of the last regular season game, which is when that they didn't include playoffs in the 1,000 yards at that time that I recall. Actually, Mercury Morse had 991 yards. He fell 9 yards short. And, Gary, they retraced and retracked somehow and found that there was a 9-yard loss that was credited to him that actually belonged to Earl Morrill. And he got his 1,000 yards. Just kind of a side note, not a big deal, but just crazy. Yeah, the great times with the Miami Dolphins, Bob Baumhauer, certainly the great Alabama players, several great Alabama players.
Yeah, Nathan.
For Don Shula, Don McNeil, Dwight Stevenson, just many guys that played on those great teams that the Dolphins had. And so, yeah, he was certainly one of the all-time legends.
Yeah, and of course his son Mike came here to play quarterback, and later, as we said, was the head coach. He'll certainly be missed. I said earlier too, Rodney, and you're a little bit older than me, but it's also a reminder. You mentioned growing up that we're getting older, and guys that we grew up watching, and as athletes and coaches, we're losing them, man. We're starting to lose them at a pretty quick rate. It's one of the downsides of getting old. Hey, I want to ask you about recruiting. Tennessee is grabbing all the headlines, man. What can I say? I mean, they're the dead period has been anything but dead from them. They're getting They're getting a commitment every day. I mean, they're blowing up. You follow the Alabama program the closest, but you look at the SEC. What do you make of this flurry of activity for the Tennessee Vols on the recruiting trail?
Well, a couple of things. I think they've gotten some good players. Obviously, maybe a great player, too. Certainly Dylan Brooks, the in-state player in Alabama, a tremendous five-star player. And I know they got Terrence Lewis, who is a Florida five-star, but according to some. And, again, I think he's changed schools a few times, and there's some concern there. But overall, they're getting some solid players, I think, Gary. To me, I think that they're using this as an opportunity to gain some early momentum, kind of get their name out there and maybe encourage some other guys that are on the fence that are considering Tennessee to jump on board quickly. So I think that's really what they're doing. Not a bad strategy to kind of create the perception that they're on a roll right now, and maybe they're becoming a hot program. And who knows? Maybe they are. I will say this. They won, 6 in a row last year, I think, the end of the season, if I'm not mistaken, something like that. They didn't really beat, I wouldn't say, great teams. They beat Kentucky, Missouri, Vanderbilt, and Indiana down the stretch. And, those are all, solid teams, but and could have probably lost at least 2 or 3 of those games. It very easily could have lost 2 or 3. But that's the key. They found ways to win rather than find ways to lose, which they did earlier in the season, as you remember. Lost a couple of stunners. Who was it? Georgia State that beat them in the opener, and then also Brigham Young came back in the waning seconds to beat them, I believe it was. So, but now, as you saw it, they're kind of building some momentum down the stretch. So it's going to be interesting to watch Jeremy Pruitt and see if he can take the next step. This is a big year in terms of, does Jeremy Pruitt take this Tennessee program to the next step? I
agree. As far as Alabama recruiting, you've got a couple of interesting pieces out at TiderInsider.com. Tide looking to fill its needs in 2021 class. You point out the positions where you think Alabama really needs to do well. And you also had a piece, this might get Alabama fans' attention, on J.C. Latham, the 5-star offensive tackle out of IMG Academy in Bradenton, Florida, 6'6", 315. He was caught off guard by Alabama's interest, but now that they've shown some serious interest, he seems pretty interested himself in what Alabama has to offer.
Yeah, a lot of people thought he was locked up for Ohio State. Oklahoma's in there, LSU's in there, Clemson, Georgia. Some other schools, Clemson and Georgia, have jumped in the mix late like Alabama has. I say later than Ohio State for sure, who's been recruiting him since he was a sophomore in high school. So, but 6'6", 315 pounds, great shape. I mean, this guy has all the tools, no question about that. And Alabama, I know that Nick Saban called him on the night of the draft, right as Jedrick Wills was being selected, and said, "Hey, you come here in 3 years, that could be you." And that really got J.C. Latham's attention. And you think about the history now, the track record that Nick Saban has, not only for developing all these guys as NFL first-round draft picks, but the first round offensive tackles that he's put out, or second round in some cases. Cam Robinson should have probably been a first rounder, but he's had this history now, of developing these guys, and that certainly has J.C. Latham's attention. And I think, to me, offensive tackle is one of the very key positions in this recruiting class. And if Alabama could land a J.C. Latham and a Tommy Brockemeyer, who some people think is the number one offensive tackle in the country out of the Fort Worth area in Texas, they land those two guys. I mean, that's the foundation of your offense, I think, for the future. Man, and you got some of this young talent that they brought in this past class. Obviously Bryce Young. All these running backs that they brought in, some tremendous players. And then this year, I think also a priority is wide receiver. So they've got Ajay Hall committed. We talked about him on one of your recent shows. And then they're recruiting several other wide receivers that, this could be another really top-notch class on the offensive side. And I think they've got a chance to be very strong on the defensive side as well, where I think you always want defensive linemen. They've got Anquin Barnes committed, who I think is vastly underrated right now. You'll see his stock rise. Damon Payne is a guy to watch out of Michigan, who's a five-star type player. And I think in the secondary, that's a key point. Alabama has to do extremely well in the secondary, Gary. And guess what? We've talked about this many times, and I know this is something that's one of your pet peeves in recruiting. You want to get the best guy in the state of Alabama. And to me, for Alabama, that's probably Quincy McKinstry out of Pinson Valley. He's a great athlete, a great cornerback prospect.
Great stuff as always, Rodney, and TiderInsider.com. We referenced it with those two stories and much, much more available for still just $48 a year.
Yep, $48 a year. We haven't gone up in 15 or 16 years, Gary. It's been a while. And so it's only $48 a year, $4 a month. Gives you access to all our premium information, which, again, hopefully things will start picking up really soon, and we'll get into the summer and hopefully get the players back and all of that stuff. And then, our forum is rolling a little bit, and also the quad, where there's a lot of discussion about the virus and the latest information on that.
Enjoyed it, Rodney. Thank you.
Thank you, buddy.